Oh man, the new next level is discussions about race. And so, as Mike is joining me today, we have been having lots of conversations at our house about school and what we're going to do with our kiddos come fall. And we are actually going to be doing a special new next level episode all around how we're making decisions about what we're doing in the fall. So stay tuned for that in the next week or so. But today we are talking about our own educations. And Mike asked me a really interesting question the other night about like, what did you learn about race in your history classes? And I really, I felt super defensive in a way and also really bashful about it. And I'm actually curious about that question, Mike. Like, what were you expecting me to say? How
I
did you
didn't,
think that was going to go down?
I didn't really have an expectation because I don't know. I know the conversations that we've had with present day with other parents who have older children, the discussions around what was in their history textbooks, and even what the instructors or the teachers themselves were taught. And so I, it just kind of sparked the curiosity about what your experience was like. And I think it's different for everyone.
Can you adjust your headphone, honey? I'm getting a little bit of a feedback around where that is. Thank you.
How's
That's better.
that?
Thank you. Oh, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you better too. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Yeah, so I was just curious. I didn't really have an expectation of how you were going to answer. So how's that for an answer to your question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, education, especially with people like us who do have kiddos, right? Who are trying to figure out what we're going to do based on CDC recommendations and based on people saying don't follow CDC recommendations and school districts and federal government, state. I mean, it's like enough to make your head spin.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I, and we've talked about this multiple times, we make decisions based on our values.
Yep.
And our value of connection and family and contribution and racial justice, all of those pieces are on the table every day. And so as we were talking about like how I was raised with history, and like when I think of history, and this is, again, these conversations are for those of you that are still participating in conversations about race and racial justice. We understand that COVID has taken over the headlines. Like the month of May and June, end of May, all of June, seemed like it was dedicated to racial justice. And that smacks of how I was actually taught history. Black history was separated out and given its month in February. And I feel like we're kind of having a repeat of that in some way, or a mirror image of that. Anyhow, these conversations are for those of you who are still in it and who are in it for the long haul, who you have a value of racial justice and social justice. And this is not for the people who are like, you know, having their Ku Klux Klan robes pressed right now. And these are not, I know, no shit, I know, dude, but no shit. And these are not for the people.
It's true. It's not for them.
No,
I'm just
not trying to convince anybody of anything. We are very mindfully having these conversations still, because this still is a matter of life or death in our family. And with that said, we had this bookended moment in time, it felt like, where the headlines were all about race, right? Now, yeah, we're still, you know, depending upon when you're listening to this, it's July of 2020, and we are still smack dab in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And the way that the news cycle has gone is very similar to the way I was taught about history. And that's the parallel I want to draw, is like February was kind of that time where we learned all about Black history, because Black history was separate than real history. That's how I was taught it, right? Like our history was the founding fathers. Our history was, it was a white male's perspective, like memorize the presidents in order, because for some reason that's super important. Doesn't matter what that presidents actually did. but memorize them in order and stand up in front of the class and do it. Martin Luther King was a good guy. Malcolm X was violent, so don't follow him. Like, it was, I remember I shared this with you in middle school. I had a teacher who we watched Roots from start to finish, but it was like, you came in, the lights went off, you watched the movie, you left class. We didn't discuss race, and we didn't discuss history in a tangible way. And when you started talking about your history, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
well, shit, I'm catching up. I'm in remedial history right now. Not even just in remedial history, like I'm coming to it for the first time.
Mm.
Rant over, your turn.
Well, I think it's a function of geography too, right?
Mm.
It is. I mean, I think it's a function of geography. I think it's a function of
You mean in
prior.
history?
Well,
Like how
what
we're
is?
taught history?
Yes. Yeah. I think that it's multifaceted. You know,
I
it's
mean, and
not,
just for the
and it's.
record, I grew up in the Midwest, like in between cornfields, as Mike likes to put out. So,
Oh, come on.
well,
There's
yeah, anyway.
soybean fields there too, right?
Anyway,
All
very
right.
white cornfields.
So, not and don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's solely down to geography. It's also down to um, the teacher and their
Mm.
experience, and the district and their curriculum and their guidelines. You know,
Their
textbook
values.
publishers. Yep. And so, but I also think that, you know, I grew up in a town that was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and so um, there was, you know, a little bit more of an emphasis on the the history of African Americans in the United States, and Jim Crow and the segregate and Reconstruction, and so I learned about those things in you know, elementary school and junior high. But then if you were to talk to, for an example, I think I'm trying to remember. I think it's one of the friend of ours has a child who was in junior high, and they were taught, you
Like
know,
last year.
right. Well, first of all, this, and I don't know this to be true. This is just from the conversation that we had. So, but the history textbook was from the 1990s,
And to me, that was just last year. So that doesn't sound that long ago, but I understand what you mean.
it doesn't, you know, but it's and the sentiment of the teacher was that the civil rights movement ended in the 60s and everything is cool, you know, like black people got the right to vote, they can marry white people, like we're good, man. And that, I believe, is a function of the fact that their textbooks also were lacking in information. And so I think the world, not the world, well, maybe the world, you know, but for sure in the United States, most people are playing catch up.
I missed that last part. What did you say?
I said for sure in the United States, most people are playing historical catch up.
And it's optional.
Not the condiment, but like the.
Yeah, no, I am with you.
Okay.
But it's optional, I think. And for people like
no,
me,
not
let me,
anymore.
well, I'm going to disagree on that.
Okay.
Like, it shouldn't be optional.
It shouldn't be optional. And if in fact you are one of those people who are interested in participating in a conversation that's going to facilitate some kind of meaningful change, it's not optional.
And you and I have talked about this multiple times, where it's like the status quo for middle class white people is being disrupted in lots of ways, right? Like work and school and going to the grocery store, and there's this mask war that's happening, and on and on and on. But for the most part, a lot of people's lives are not, at least they can't see it, not directly impacted by race. This is a white person's perspective, because we don't consider ourselves even having a race. And I am going to speak for a lot of unconscious white people. I have not considered that I have a race. Like, that isn't I'm just a white person. It does not play a role in my decision making. That's how embedded in the system I am and have been. I have to actively seek out history. I have to, like, I even went to the local bookstore. Thank you, Foxton. I love you, Heather. And I said, I can't do one more book on race right now, man. I need to have a little bit of a reprieve. I'm still building my stamina. I'm still recognizing how deep this shit goes.
And you
And
get
so,
that. Like, you get to have a reprieve.
I know. And that in and of itself is that white privilege piece that's so, like, that term is irritating to many people. To me, it's like I feel like it's the Russian nesting dolls of just when I think I got to the smallest doll, I realize that it doesn't ever end. And being able to have a reprieve, while yes, that is a white privilege thing, it's also really necessary for me to know when I need to take a pause so I can shore up and keep moving along in alignment with my values. Like, even doing this conversation today, I was like, well, maybe we need to just take a break for a week. And it was like, no, man, you just got to keep going. And yet there is real fatigue. I'm actually shocked that race stayed in the news as long as it did. I feel like our attention span is really short, which is why history is so interesting to learn about American history, and American history meaning white American history, white male American history, because very rarely do you see any of the voices being anybody of color or women. I mean, that just wasn't, I was never taught women's history, or you get Women's History Month and Black History Month as though those are the subset of a historical value. But the twist on that, with having like February be Black History Month, is that, look, we're giving it its place. Oh, you froze here, babe. Are you back? You froze. Could you hear me at all?
Yeah.
That there's this element of like, well, let's highlight it, right? And highlighting it then makes it other. It doesn't make it us. It makes it separate. And yeah, I said a lot there. What did you hear? And what would you like to comment on?
I feel like there's so many opportunities. It's overwhelming. I know there's fatigue on lots of levels.
Do you have it?
And I do. I had a conversation with our son, Noah. I know you know his name.
Thank you. What did you?
We were talking about, the fatigue of it, and like wanting to just be able to go hang out with your friends. And I'm like, I feel that too, and we're making different decisions because the world is different right now.
Right.
And so while we may be suffering from a level of fatigue and irritation, it doesn't negate our responsibility to our neighbors and those people who have conditions that might put them at an elevated level of risk due to somebody else's
COVID you're talking about now, and
yes,
race maybe too.
Right. I mean, it's all connected. I mean, I think the idea that this is something that I've heard other places as well, that this time in history right now we've been presented with an opportunity because of the amount of pullback that there's been on a social level. It's given people an opportunity to really have some self-examination. And I think
can you hear Maxwell barking here?
I can. I can't hear him in here, but I can hear him in my headphones. It's weird. Anyway, so I just think there's an opportunity for
when you say pullback, what do you mean?
Like, pullback from like school and work and yes, all the stay-at-home orders around here have been lifted and people are going somewhat back to normal. But at the same time, especially from that period in March through May, I think there's an opportunity for some self-examination. It's giving people time to sit with their thoughts. It's not always pleasant, but it's necessary. And I think the way that people look, not everyone, I just want to be clear that we're not, like you said, we're not trying to change people's minds. We're trying to reinforce what, where people are, if they're moving along that continuum of change.
I think these conversations are really designed as conversation starters. It's not this isn't the space where you're going to be like, okay, Mike and Heidi are the teachers and here's the lesson. It's more like, hey, this is the shit we're talking about behind closed doors. And for you to do that self-examination and to have, I think of it as a prompt where it's like, hey man, what was your history education? What were you taught about Black history? What were the messages? How was it presented to you?
Like
and how's that working out for you?
When you were talking about the distinction between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and the connotation behind that, like Malcolm X was the bad one because he was aggressive, but Martin Luther King was one of the good ones, right? That term, he was an acceptable Negro, right, for most people. But Malcolm X was not, because his viewpoint and his agenda was aggressive. But I think if you know anything about his history, like he had a grudge, he had a chip on his shoulder, and rightly so.
Right.
And so,
and how the extent of my experience with learning about Malcolm X was probably like a 15-minute segment of a 52-minute class. I mean, the conversation about history sparked a broader conversation about education, which sparked a conversation about our medical system, which sparked a conversation about, how disconnected we are just in general, that we've compartmentalized our lives to the point of disconnection. And that really is the overarching theme on so many levels.
And I mean, it's health and culture and education. None of those are separate. Right. And I think the sooner
go ahead.
people can understand that, the more, the sooner we can kind of come to a collective agreement about how to move forward in like a meaningful way.
I think I'm not even actually hoping for a collective. I'm looking at it as like the people in the middle, and I consider myself in the middle, where for the most part my life just was on like a lazy river type of path. I didn't really have to be engaged because the shit didn't really affect me. I was, insulated, small town, parents were married, all my needs were met, most of my wants were met. Like for the most part, I didn't have those pieces that would put me back. Did I have my shit? Absolutely. But when I look at the way that I was raised, I didn't have to be engaged if I didn't want to. That became optional. And so when I look at the way that history was presented to me, it was as a subject of things that have already happened that have no bearing on what's going on today. Except now I'm looking at my education and race going, what the actual hell happened? And how are our economic policies based on that? How are our healthcare policies based on that?
Criminal justice.
The way that we treat one another as human beings.
Even down to the language that we use around.
Even down to our names.
I listened to a podcast last night about the history of conflict on the southern border of the United States. And I think it was Truman.
Current day oh no.
Well, I mean, in the last 100 years, like there's always been kind of this thing with the border along the southern part of the United States. And so just for some context, during World War II, all the working age white males were deployed to either, the Pacific theater or the European theater. And so economically, they needed to replace those workers, especially in the agricultural sector. So they brought in, they had a program to bring in all these workers from South America and Mexico to work. And then after the war was over, they shut it down, but these people were still wanting to come. And so Truman set up this program, like an immigration program. They called it Operation Wetback.
Holy
How
shit.
fucked
Okay.
up is that, you know?
Hold
As
on.
a way to, you know, it was a, you know, as a border patrol and all, you know, people from coming across the board. Operation Wetback. Like, I mean, that's what I'm talking about when we're talking about language and the systemic way that it is just woven into the culture. Like it was no big deal, you know? And that's a pejorative term, you know, like it was then and it still is. But so that's the history that we're, you know, that we're working with. It's everywhere.
I don't even know where to go with that, because
It's
my
not as
whole like,
simple. So here's the other thing, like the conversation that I think I've had with you. If we're talking about things in a historical context, it's not enough to just read a book about white fragility or white, you know, whatever the thing is, you know, to start the process for yourself. You have to have context around it. And so, yeah, here's a book that's going to point out the things that, you know, you might be doing intentionally or unintentionally as a privileged white individual, but it's also important to understand the context in which all of these things have been afforded you.
well, let me be super candid that
begs the you know, the importance of having a more whole picture of our country's history. So
well, and let me be super vulnerable here. I started reading books like White Fragility and all, you know, I have a stack now for personal development reasons. That isn't the reason you should do that, by the way, but that's where it began, where it was like, holy shit, what happened? Here's the book list for good white women. Right. Read these first. Yep. And it started for me as personal development, and where it has led to is for me to go, oh shit, this is not about personal development. This is about acceptance of my complicity in a structure that systematically creates imbalance, systematically creates violence for people that I have not even actively or consciously been participating in, and recognizing that I'm a racist, not an overt violent KKK member, but that I benefit from structural racism, and I have, right? And then it becomes like, where does this come from? I mean, it sparked me wanting to do my genealogy, and I told you I was afraid to do it because I have a German background and I didn't want to know. How many of us just don't want to know, you guys? How many of us are like, fuck, I really don't want to know. I was more concerned about, you know, there being Nazis in my background. And then it was like, oh shit, I probably have slave owners. Like, we don't, but there was this matter of like, I needed to know. I wanted to not know, actually.
And it's important to know.
The reason it's important isn't for, I mean, initially there was fear, and initially there's shame, and initially there's like, okay. And now it's like, but what do you do with it? I realize how much I don't know. And there's an element of shame that comes with that for me. But shame is no longer a reason not to. Shame moves through you if you allow it.
And the realization, that self-actualization about your historical, this deficit, I guess is the word, you know, like those things that you don't know, is that then you have the opportunity to educate yourself. And there's no shortage of information out there now with the World Wide Web. And, you know, I sound like an 80-year-old guy now, not to be ageist.
On the email.
On the internet.
The interwebs.
My AOL.
Right.
You know, there's so much information out there. If you just know, you know, if you just look. But it does require active participation. This isn't going to be a passive through osmosis. Oh, I know a black guy, so I must not be a racist.
Or I'm married to a black guy, so I must not be racist.
Right.
And can I be black? You know, all those questions that we've circled, like what's appropriate? How do you?
There's an awesome podcast called Yo, Is This Racist?
I like that. Who's it by? Or
I can't remember.
We'll put a link to it. Okay.
Yeah, I've been sharing some stuff.
Well, how many times have I asked that of you? Like, dude, can I say this? Or, is that racist what I just said? Or, I mean, it started out in jest.
It's become a thing now where you're like, what's the origin of that phrase?
Yes.
And I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Well, okay, so here's one. What was the name of that documentary that we were watching the other night, where the guy was
Oh,
interviewing the Confederate Confederate flag dude, and he was like, the white guy's last name was Cotton, and he was introducing himself to the black man, and he was like, yeah, my name is blah 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 Cotton, like you pick, and it's like, what the fuck did you just say?
I know.
So, but I mean, that's a really blatant example, but there are, like cotton picking. That's another one. Like, saw an episode of The Simpsons where Homer was yelling at Bart and calling him a cotton picking something or other, and I'm like, that shit's racist. You can't say that. Now, like it puts a lot of things into perspective when you're.
Well, and I think that there's
language.
this tension of this push pull of like, I want to be a part of the solution. And then I get to the point where I want to be part of the solution, but I feel like I'm going to fuck it up, or I'm not going to be politically correct, or I'm going to say something that's racist, or I'm going to say something that's going to offend.
You know what I'm going to say though, right?
Let me finish first. Yes. You say it anyway.
Right.
For me, where it's that point of tension is where I do my self-examination. And for me as a leader, not as a leader as in I have it all figured out, but as in I'm sure shit not going to set idle. You say it and be willing to be corrected. Be willing to get in it and get messy and have your feelings hurt and have someone call you a racist and go, you know what, you're probably right. It's not my intention, but teach me. What were you going to say?
I was going to say the only way you can fuck it up is if you don't do it.
Right.
And that's your stretch then, right? Like,
and it's honoring those feelings, but we as white women, especially white women in the coaching space, are taught like, honor your feelings and how does that make you feel, and this whole movement towards how are you feeling, which is only one part of it. Your feelings only matter to a point. At some point your feelings have to become secondary to people dying. At some point your feelings have to actually propel you towards action, and that it matters. And I think, circling this back to our history, you and I have a different experience with history, and we have a different experience with being male and female. We have a different experience with being black and white. And the collective of history is still history. But it's how do we interact with it as adults? Like you and I would explain you to people, like he's a vault when it comes to facts. He's a vault when it comes to geography and history. And if you ask him who was in the war, he's not only going to tell you like who was in that particular war, but where did they come from? Those countries don't exist anymore. Like you have a natural affinity for that. And it was led by curiosity for you, right? Like an interest in it. My interest now is coming from a different place, and it isn't because I'm in 11th grade civics class and I got to pass a test. It's because the culture that we are creating, and apparently I'm an adult in our culture. I don't know when the hell that happened, but it is my job to really truly to facilitate at least sparking these conversations, at least sparking the interest, at least sparking the self-examination of what were you actually taught and how's that working out for you.
And how is that playing into the role that you've taken in the world now, and how you interact with it?
Right.
Yeah, I think about.
Did you have Black History Month? Was that a thing, or did you just have history, especially when you were in Oberlin?
I mean, it was always a thing. It's we talked about the origins of it last night. It started out as a week, and then I think, who was it? Was it Carter? Ford. It was Gerald Ford who advocated to
make it a month.
Be a month
in like 76, right?
Yeah.
Because I was like, that was the year my sister was born. That's why I remembered it.
But it was started by an organization that was kind of akin to the NAACP. It was an organization that was started by African Americans for, you know, to talk about the accomplishments and the contributions. And man, if you think about it from a macro perspective, the contributions that, you know, to the beginning of this country, like the foundational piece of it was on the backs of African Americans. But he's, you know, they're taking what they can get, right? And so we'll just have it be a week, and we'll talk about, you know, the contributions from a societal standpoint, you know, science and math and whatever. But it wasn't. We didn't. I don't know. How do I? I mean, yeah, Black History Month it was a national thing, but I don't think it was the same as it might have been in Washington.
In a predominantly white cornfield.
Where, yeah.
And I'm not saying I didn't.
I remember moving here
go ahead.
from the East Coast, and the high school that I went to didn't have the day off for Martin Luther King Day, and I was like, what? That's crazy. So we didn't go to school that day. We skipped that day.
Mm-hmm. And that, I mean, I remember coloring worksheets of I Have a Dream, and I shared with you that when I was in high school, we took a choir trip to Georgia, and that was probably the most impactful experience that I had with learning anything about Martin Luther King Jr., where it was, I mean, we were at Ebenezer Baptist Church and we saw the eternal flame, and we went to Stone Mountain. I mean, it was like this, I'm not sure how much more contrasted you get, but it was, I remember talking to you about this last night, even standing in that church, and it's a very modest church, and having this experience of like, and at that time, you know, he was so much older than me in my mind, like he was an adult leader. Now I'm looking like, oh God, I'm older, like, but having the experience of being in that reverent place, and also not really truly having the full context of his contribution, or of my lack of richness around what I could have learned, what I should have been learning, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that wasn't your job though.
But it's my job now.
It is
and
now, but I'm
I
saying
think
like
that
not to hold yourself responsible for the actions or the inactions of your teacher, you know, like,
yeah, I mean, I had some excellent
choir
teachers,
teacher,
but
right? Like,
right. And I also think that within the context of music, and I had a great, you know, choir experience, and we joke about every song that comes on that I'm like, I sang that for show choir, and I totally did.
I got one that you didn't though the other night, right?
What?
Like, there was a song that was on and you were jamming out to it, and I was like, let me guess, and you're like, no, I didn't sing this one.
Oh, I don't remember that. I mean, that was like probably the only one.
The only one in 22 years. So.
Right. But I think that the history of what we were singing, I mean, I remember singing, they called them slave songs, like some of our warm-up songs. They were, you know, like, I know. But there's this, I do feel like I was cheated out of lots of enrichment. I do feel like by not knowing the full scope of your history and how it's actually woven into every other part of your life, that there's a piece missing, and pieces missing, and empathy that is not able to be cultivated, and change that is not able to be made, not by like going over history to the point where you're not taking action, but going over your history so you can.
Well, and I think that's a product of the sanitization. Like, we don't want to feel those things, that we don't want to feel guilt or shame, or so we're just not going to include it, because we don't want people to feel bad about the actions of their ancestors, when in actuality, give them the opportunity to process that and figure out how they want to move forward. But also, like, if you don't talk about it, it's just going to continue to happen, right? Like, when you compartmentalize or sanitize it, and just talk about the things that are I'm air quoting the good things that happened in history, then there's no way to break the cycle.
Right. And even still, when you're saying history, like this is how much I'm dissecting and reconstructing. When you're talking about history, I am literally still thinking white men in the White House. That was the history that I was taught. We live in the best country in the world. We have our founding fathers were geniuses. We have this constitution that serves us all. And it was a history that we should have been proud of. Look at all of the progress. Look at the ways that we always overcome. And through the white male gaze, that may actually be true.
I mean, just look at, I'm gonna, the state constitution of Alabama still to this day has as one of its core foundational features, or is to uphold the idea of white supremacy. Like that is literally written into the Constitution of the state of Alabama today still. That's history. That's our history.
Right. And I think that, like, as we kind of wind down or wind up or bookend today's conversation, that at least for me, this is really about my re-education process so that I am able to contribute in a holistic way. That it's important for me to know my history. It's important for me to feel that. It's important that when I'm thinking about history, I'm thinking of it in a robust, rounded out, non-sanitized way. Not so I can feel ashamed, but so that I can feel what I need to feel so I can actually take action. And that will always go back to our values. And I think we have to be willing. This is the conversation that's happening current day. And we may ruffle some feathers, but whatever. Around mask wearing, where it's like, yeah, but they said before that they shouldn't, or we don't have to, or we shouldn't. And now they're saying we should. And so they lied. And it's like, okay, we have to be allowed to evolve. We have to be allowed to change our fucking minds when we have new information. That is how shit changes. We have to be able to have self-reflection and go, the decisions that I made 20 years ago, I have learned from. I'm not just going to continue to make those choices because I made them once. Just because the history that you were taught does not include anybody of color other than Martin Luther King Jr. does not mean that you stopped learning. Just because 3 months ago mask wearing maybe was a little bit iffy and now the science has changed, it doesn't mean you can't change your mind based on new information or based on new self-reflection. We have to be able to change our minds and our hearts and our policies based on what is happening.
Yeah. And I think that that's the lesson or the blessing. And I'm not saying that COVID is a blessing, but we don't know shit about this virus. And so things are going to change rapidly. Where are we at? We're operating like at a week at a time, that's about as far out in advance as I can get. Because by the end of the week, things could change.
Yeah, if you ask us what we're doing in August, we don't know.
Right. And I think if you say you do know, you're probably mistaken,
Or like you're not in a space of flexibility, but flexibility is a value of ours. Oh, you paused, babe. I think it's I can hear you now. Go ahead, baby.
Come on.
No, I can hear you.
I was just gonna say, I think it's really, it's really, we talk about those "are you sure" moments. Like this is the biggest one, and it's it's like, are you sure? Are you sure? Like just take a breath.
Say more about that. Are you sure?
Like you have to be flexible. Like you really have to be, and then you really have to make intentional decisions about where and what you're gonna go do if and when you decide to do something.
Are you speaking
for lots.
specifically about COVID?
I'm talking about COVID, and I'm talking about race. Like, I think about it in the terms of, when I go for a run,
Mm.
and I'm thinking about it in terms of like going to the store or to the beach. Like, everything just takes a little bit more planning and thoughtfulness now.
Mm. I'm finding that I'm dancing between feeling really grateful that it takes more intention and feeling really resentful
Mm-hmm.
that it takes more intention, and everything. There's a laboriousness that there's no end in sight. And I think that is one of the hardest parts, where yes, yesterday going into a bookstore saying I need a break, like I need to like recharge, is maybe a white privilege piece. And it's also part of my long game. It's also a way for me to go, okay, I am actively in this for the long haul. How do I manage the oppressiveness of what is happening and the momentum of what is happening at the same time? And I know so many of you are feeling the fatigue of, it's like, it's this dual conversation that's incessant. And I think the race conversation is dying down in a lot of ways, which is why we're just going to keep going.
Yeah,
Like,
don't get distracted, y'all. I mean, seriously, like,
mhm.
go ahead.
But it matters for you to know what your long game is, and have your long game, even if that's a day at a time or a week at a time or a month at a time, have your long game be in alignment with what your values are. And Mike and I are working on a training around that, so that you can stop like thinking, what are my values, and you can actually get concrete about them. But I'm curious, as we wrap, babe, if you have any other final thoughts. If you are, yeah, final thoughts, babe. You're so cutely paused. So
I Am
go
I
ahead.
still paused?
I can hear you, but
Okay.
yeah, you're a little pausy. Go ahead.
Okay. I would encourage or challenge people to find an outlet that provides a perspective that they might not be familiar with when it comes to the historical perspective, and then share what that is. Like, it could be a book, it could be a podcast, it could be a documentary, it could be I don't know.
You're
It
in
has
ultra slow
recommend
motion.
but
Well,
like, take that stretch. So
you're in ultra
cool.
slow motion. What I think I heard you say was a book, a podcast, a documentary,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was
Not
slow
a movie.
motion. Not a movie.
Okay. Not like 12 Years a Slave or something like that. That's a historical dramatization, but something that's rooted in like actual historical fact. So
And I think for me, it's been about diversifying what I'm consuming on many levels,
mm-hmm.
and being, and also being enriched by it, like listening to different music than maybe I'd listened to before, reading authors that I read as required reading, and then reading them through the lens of an adult. Even watching documentaries about Toni Morrison and Nina Simone, and these women, God, these women that were just like so fucking powerful. And for me to have things broadened and deepened, it, you get fortified in a different way as well. And final thoughts for me, I guess, are to continue to be as uncomfortable as you can be. Like, that discomfort matters. It matters, and it is a place of privilege, I think, to be uncomfortable. Like, when you're choosing that discomfort, there's a difference between people who are suffering and that discomfort is systemically stacked against them. I have the weird luxury of choosing to stay uncomfortable, of staying engaged. And so if you are in a similar place of privilege, choosing to be uncomfortable sounds really counterintuitive. And we're just going to keep inviting you in, like that.
Mm-hmm.
Come and be uncomfortable with us. That matters. So your new next level really is about examining your history and examining the way you were taught history, and then it becomes the re-education. What is that? That's a Lauryn Hill album, right? Is that a re-education of Lauren? Is that real? Is that an
I think
album of
so.
hers?
Yeah,
The
sounds right.
re-education of Lauryn Hill. Anyway, thank you for doing this again. We're just going to keep
Yeah.
coming with it, and stay tuned. We're going to be doing a special feature on how we're deciding what happens with our kiddos for the school year 2020-21. Stay tuned for that. And we are going to be sharing all of these lives on our new podcast as well, called The New Next Level. So stay tuned. We're going to be dropping details on that over the next couple of weeks. Thank you, friends, for joining us again. I'm Heidi Mitro with The New Next Level, with my gorgeous, beautiful, intelligent husband, Michael Mitro. And we will catch you here again. So thank you, and we will